Hi everyone, Cecilia Gowdy-Wygant here, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about my book, Cultivating Victory, which is an examination of the women's land army and victory garden movements. So it's an examination of both what happens in the United States, in Great Britain, and it's kind of a compare and contrast. We see during this time, really there's this intersectionality of nationalism and gender and racial considerations that create this really unique movement that provides both nourishment for people during wartime, but also an opportunity to reclaim identity and place in space in labor. So this story, and I'll be brief, but it really begins, maybe during the beginning of the progressive era. If we think back before the 20th century even starts, we have this movement in Great Britain, especially when they think about their gardens. Today, if you hear the term English garden, what comes to mind? Usually something that is, full of flowers, very ornate, manicured, well-attended, those kinds of things. And that really stems from, British culture from the time. And if we take a look at what's going on before this, kind of international progressive era, we see that really it's a class structure, gardening is. And we see that individuals that tend to their aesthetic gardens, they will plant things like flowers, they will spend time manicuring these gardens. But those that would plant gardens that produced edible plants, that was looked at as something for the lower classes. Because if you were to produce your own food, that meant you were laboring for something that was needed. And maybe that suggested that you didn't have enough. So women in Great Britain were often encouraged to do certain kinds of things with their time. And it mostly had to do with, what class stature that they either had with their families currently or what they were hoping to achieve in the future. But that's all about to change, because we see as things are growing and markets are growing and transportation is growing, Britain's become more and more dependent upon food being imported because they are just refusing to grow their own food. And they don't have the ability to grow their own food. And so by the time that we get to World War I, we see that in Great Britain, they are importing at least half of all of their food. And it's very obvious that a quick way to, starve them into submission would be to block off their ports. And so in the United States, once the United States gets involved in the war, and really even shortly before that, the United States realizes it needs to help out its allies, economic and cultural allies, if not political allies. And so you'll see Woodrow Wilson try to do everything that he can. There's the beginning of, the Food Administration. Herbert Hoover, is put in charge, and they're trying to do everything they can to supply the economic and political and cultural allies of the United States. It becomes very clear that they're not going to be successful unless they have food. So it becomes a mission of the United States to grow more, to support people that they've never seen. So they might grow more food on a commercial level, but they would also grow more food on a personal and family, private level. The idea is if they grew more food for themselves, then they would purchase less from their grocer. And then as you go up that chain, less and less would be purchased from the commercial farmer. And thus the United States would have access to grain and things that could be supplied to our allies. And so in addition to just consuming less by growing more food, we would see that individuals would also share with their neighbors. And once the United States was really involved in the war, this became a measure of showing your patriotism, a measure of showing that you could do your part at home when things were tough. And these gardens, they became known as war gardens because you were doing your part to support the war. They weren't actually called victory gardens until after victory was won. And then when World War II comes around, then they're going to have that label of victory gardens. But in addition to these gardens, people were encouraged to consume less food in general, to be less wasteful. They would ask women to sign pledges that they wouldn't be wasteful again in their kitchens and things like that. But these gardens were pretty successful. We see in the United States that in the short amount of time that they were involved in World War I, they produced about 3.5 million gardens, and it's estimated that about $350 million worth of food was produced out of these gardens. And so, over the course of just, this year of collected data, that's quite a substantial amount of food. It was so successful that they decided to, start this program again once World War II came around. But before we get to that, in addition to these local programs for people who are staying at home to produce more, people that had the opportunity to leave the house would have the opportunity to train to take the place of a farmer that might be going off to war. And so a wartime program known as the Women's Land Army developed. And it starts out, a couple professors decide to donate a piece of property that they own, and they want to start an agricultural program. And they start this amazing agricultural program to train young women how they can be not just temporary laborers, but educated agriculturalists themselves. And then they would not only help their country in this time, but they would also take their place in labor in the future. And so this also is very similar to things that were going on in Great Britain at the time. In Great Britain, they were trying to do everything they can to produce more, as much as they could. And so they really depended upon women to take the place of the farmers that were leaving. And in the United States, they were only active in the war for a short amount of time. But in that 1 year that the Women's Land Army existed from 1917 to 1918, they really had a substantial amount of women that would sign up. They just had, thousands and thousands of women that would never even get placed because either there wasn't room for them, or perhaps there was some resistance to having women working on the farm. I'm thinking about a cartoon where there was a farmer that was nailing mirrors on the side of a barn. Somebody asked him, why the heck he was doing this, and he just replied he was getting ready for the women to come work. And but lots of resistance. People didn't think that young co-eds who were being trained could really come out and be successful, but they showed that they could. And so these programs were really successful. And when World War II comes around, they pick them back up immediately because they know this is how they're going to survive to produce more food. And so the United States, it joins the war late again, but it's already preparing. And, Great Britain has already had its programs in complement to the Victory Gardens that were going on here. Britain had its Dig for Victory campaign, and they really tried to encourage people to grow food everywhere they could. So not just if you had a backyard large enough for a garden, but in window boxes, in urban areas, on rooftops, anywhere you could. If there was a vacant piece of land next to your home, they might title it slacker land, right? Because you're a slacker, because you're not doing something with it. So you need to get out there and to cultivate that land as quickly as possible. And in many instances, in Great Britain especially, they would seize some of this slacker land and they would turn it into an allotment garden for a community. And so if you know anything about community gardening or allotment gardening, The idea is they take a large piece of land and divide it up into equal shares, and then individuals who maybe live in urban areas, they can go out and cultivate their small piece of land to grow fresh vegetables or fresh veg, as they might say, for themselves, for their families, or neighbors and extended family that might need that assistance. So they did this in addition to supplying soup kitchens and trying to do everything they could to help out individuals. But the United States is needed again to help out. And so they take off very quickly. There's lots of propaganda that is displayed. I'm thinking about in the United States, for example, one photograph that was used a lot was of a bomb crater, actually in London. And in this particular bomb crater, an individual and his wife, we don't know the name, we're just told a Londoner and his wife have planted their own garden inside of this bomb crater. And if I'm remembering correctly, the caption reads, "Where the Nazis have sowed death, a Londoner and his wife have sown life-giving vegetables." And so there's this juxtaposition of the Nazis and death, and a Londoner and his wife are sowing vegetables. They're producing life where the Nazis have produced death. So cultivation really is a political identity. It's an identity of providing life amidst the destruction that's really going on. And so this photograph is really being circulated around the United States, and London is producing a lot of films that Americans would see if they went to the cinema, short films that would say, "London can take it, we can do it, we're working hard, and thank you for your support." But these things were really passed around because they were meant to demonstrate to Americans how dire the situation was. And so they were doing what they could, not just to support the war effort or to make things better for themselves personally amidst the times of rationing, but they were doing it for the help of others. They were doing it because somebody that they've never seen before needs their help. And I think that's just really an amazing thing to think about. In 1943 alone, over 20 million gardens were planted in the United States. The United States decided to do what it could to encourage people to, ramp up that even the next year. And so their campaign was, grow more in 44. They knew that they could do it. It's estimated that in 1944 alone, they produced, even more gardens, and they estimated that they produced about 40% of the nation's, vegetable supply. And I think that's pretty astounding. These weren't just things in backyards. New York City, on top of rooftops, in planters in people's window boxes, those kinds of things. People were growing everything they could. It was popular in schools, that we have a school garden. And so community gardens would pop up, and it's really the beginning of the community gardening movement that we still have today. It was a patriotic thing to do. They would have people register their gardens and record how much produce. And so that's where these totals come from. Of course, not everybody would register, or not everybody wanted to brag about what they produced. But from those that did, we have these pretty astounding numbers. A lot of people got involved. The Boy Scouts could come out and give you an award for having the best victory garden in your community. And it was something that people took pride in. They were helping their communities. They were eating, well. They were healthy. And, there's a little bit of competition involved. So they were able to have that competitive spirit as well. So interestingly enough, it provided an opportunity for women especially to produce more and to do more to help out in the war effort. So, there's the war front on the front lines, but then there's the home front. And it was believed that everything that you do during the day was doing your part to bring those soldiers home and to make sure that the allies were taken care of. It was really aimed, these programs were, towards women. And when I spent time in the Library of Congress, it's interesting that I found that almost all of the literature, that was being distributed was geared towards women. Images of women, the pamphlets are towards women, and trying to get them to change their actions, to learn how to garden, all of those kinds of things. And certainly men did garden, but the movement itself was geared towards women as a patriotic duty for them. So in addition to the victory gardens that were happening in urban and rural areas, we also see a women's land army develop again during World War II in the United States. And so this is what I find that's really impressive, because throughout American history, there's a lot of focus on Rosie the Riveter, the woman on the really famous sign, "We Can Do It," who's got her arm up and she's turned to the side. I'm looking very glamorous. Well, that's usually what the United States associates with the image of women, who are working during World War II. But there were a lot of women working in an agricultural scene, and most people have never heard of a women's land army. As a matter of fact, in those early years of the war, the Women's Land Army hoped that it could get about 60,000 volunteers to join in. But in just that first year, they got 600,000 women show up to volunteer, and they had more women than they had room for them. And we're going to see that a Women's Land Army sets up in every single state of the United States, except for Texas and Colorado. And in those particular states, that's a whole other story. But in those particular states, we see that they wanted to rely more on the labor of prisoners of war, and there's migrant labor, and there's issues with migrant labor. And again, that's a whole other story. But for the most part, they set up in all of these other areas. And in some states, they had dormitories that they stayed in. In some other areas, they would actually live with, a farmer's family, and they would be paid wages. And this creates some tension, especially in areas where women might not be paid for their work on, the farm. In a farm family, everyone's expected to participate, but women might not be the ones collecting wages. And in this case, women were the ones collecting wages. And so there's a lot of changes there, and it provides room for individuals to participate in that way. In this post-war era, after the war is over, these gardens really become that signal of memory of what people did. So lots of people have heard of the Victory Garden, but very few people have heard of the Women's Land Army. However, if you were to go, back to Great Britain, you would see that very few people think of the Dig for Victory campaign, because they keep thinking of those aesthetic gardens that they want to go back to. But instead, when they think about women working, they think about the land girl, as they call her. So the image of the Women's Land Army worker in Great Britain is the equivalent to our Rosie the Riveter today. And I find that really fascinating. Even though the United States had more volunteers than Great Britain did, they consider that their symbol of women working. And there are, plays written about her, the land girls, and, Royal Dalton makes china, and there's just so many different things that you can get her image on. But in the United States, it's pretty much been wiped from our memory, unfortunately. But over time, people do remember those victory gardens. And during the Cold War era, there were suggestions. Maybe they should bring it back. Maybe they, because they went from War Garden to Victory Garden. Now maybe they could call them Freedom Gardens, or maybe Liberty Gardens. What we find is that when times aren't as dire, people aren't as eager to continue to sacrifice. You know, after several decades of a Great Depression and a war and all of the sacrifices that were happening, there were fewer people interested in making those sacrifices. And so people keep bringing up that memory during times of inflation. You know, maybe people should go out and make their garden again to take care of themselves. What I find fascinating is that there's less and less interest, but people continue with the memory. However, that memory becomes rather skewed. Instead of remembering it for what it actually was and, you know, the justification and reasons behind it, people tend to see it more and more about self-sustainability and helping oneself versus helping one's neighbor, maybe even somebody that they've never seen. And around the time of the turn of the century, we get to the Y2K scares. And we have this new thing called the internet, and people are, posting all kinds of things about what you should do to prepare for Y2K. And people began to question whether they should do this victory garden thing again. And what's really curious, I find, is that instead of thinking that they might help one another, suddenly they're creating gardens to help themselves. And they're posting, you should do things like have a gun to, keep your neighbors out. And so it's all about helping oneself instead of helping each other. And so if I were to say anything, I would hope that we would take this lesson from history, that really in times of need, we should be helping each other. And if we do remember the victory garden, it's about caring for one another. Thank you.